welcome to this special edition of the Theology podcast. It's special because we have a special guest. But before we have him introduce himself, let's just go around the horn, as they say in baseball, and introduce ourselves. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor of a church in the Pacific Northwest. I've written a number of things, and I'm a senior editor for Touchstone magazine. Tom.
I'm Tom Price. I teach systematic theology, Christian ethics, philosophy, and a host of other things. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
All right, Glenn.
And I'm Glenn Sunshine, Senior Fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, Ministry Associate at Reflections Ministries. Got my own ministry, Every Square Inch Ministries, and I juggle a whole lot of other stuff too.
Great. Okay, Steve, introduce yourself.
I'm Steve Jeffery. I'm one of the pastors at All Saints Presbyterian Church in Fort Worth, Texas. Previously, I was pastor in London, England, that is, as you can probably tell from the
we didn't think you were
bit of an accent.
Yeah, we didn't think you were from Texas. We know that accent.
Yeah, somebody introduced me recently as being from East Texas. 5,000 miles east is probably about right. Yeah, so I'm pastor here with Pastor Jeff Shaw. I've been here for about 3.5 years now, and this is the city and the church wherein the works-based conference that is going to be. Kyle Hessler, who's running the conference, is a member here, and so it's been fun in the last few weeks just to jump on board that with him as one of the speakers and try and help and provide some input to it.
Yeah, that's great. I met Kyle, and he was actually out our way, and we spent a little time talking, so I got to know him a little bit. And I'm going to be one of the speakers, and looking forward to it. Jumping into it, we're Reformed guys. This is sort of like inside baseball, to stick with the baseball theme here. And when you say works-based, generally that raises the hackles on the back of the neck for most people in the Reformed world. What in the world were you guys thinking when you named it that?
Well, I should clarify first up that I'm going to be answering some of these questions on behalf of Kyle Hessler, who's running the conference, and so I'm going to try and guess what he said. But he told me his suggestion for the name of this conference, and I will come in a moment maybe to where the conference kind of came from. But I liked the idea of the name for a number of reasons. First, because I gather that in urban slang, based means something like the opposite of debased, and
right.
So there's a sense in which what Kyle's wanting to do and what the conference is all about, and what I know you and I as speakers are trying to bring to it, is some kind of practical pushback against the debasement of work in various Christian circles.
Yeah, that's great.
The other element, to the extent that there's a slightly edgy aspect to the theological connotations of the title, we're wanting to point out that the Reformed insistence on justification by faith alone does not for a moment mean that faith exists alone, or that our lives of faithfulness don't matter. And for a lot of people, in fact, probably for most people, a third of their time and half or more of their waking time is spent doing work of one kind or another. And it just feels like, I don't know, a lot of people have made this observation, it just feels like there is space still for giving people opportunities to think about work, to reflect on work from a biblical and theological standpoint, and also to actually practically develop some new ways in which they could go about doing their work as Christians. And so I think this conference is aimed at doing both those things.
That's great. Yeah, I was familiar with the kind of the younger folk and their use of the word based. It took me a while to catch on. I didn't know what in the world that they were getting.
Yeah, you and me both, brother.
But they would compliment me sometimes and say, "You're based," and I was like, I guess that's a good thing.
Yeah, that sounds like it couldn't be an insult too long.
That's right. Well, that's great. Well, we're certainly on board with you with all of the things that you've just mentioned. Interesting, though, when people think about the Reformed, either they fall off on one side of the road or the other. Either we are antinomian or we're legalists, depending on who's critiquing us at the time. But anyway, leaving that behind, I do guess, or I do think that maybe it would be good to get into the relationship between, say, what we mean sometimes when we're talking about works theologically speaking, and as they relate to justification, what we mean by works vocationally speaking, which I think is what we're talking about at the conference more.
Yeah. Well, maybe one way of framing it is that vocational work is one aspect of our works in the Lord. So I was teaching a theology class this morning. The class is on eschatology. We got to the last session. We're reading an essay by my old friend David Field, who was formerly a professor at the seminary where I studied at Oak Hill in London many, many moons ago. And he wrote an essay arguing at length that everything that we do in our lives now before our physical death endures into the resurrection. Everything lasts. And that includes all of the deeds done in the body, which includes vocation. And so in that sense, then, what we're wanting to say is, okay, let's just sidestep for a second. We're not saying we're not pushing back at all against a thoroughly reformed doctrine of faith union with Christ as the basis of our justification and our righteousness in God's sight. What we're wanting to do is to say that we want to recapture specifically vocational work as an aspect of our works in the Lord that really, really matter. And I think just to anticipate where the conversation normally goes in this kind of domain, Reformed people, as I experience the conversations, have generally heard enough about a broader Reformed concern for faith and life or for the creation mandate and so on, for this not to be completely new. So you stick around in a Reformed church for long enough and somebody will mention that Genesis 1:26-28 talks about our responsibilities to the world around us that touch on every area of our lives, and whether it's framed as a kind of Kuyperianism, or whether it's framed as a sort of Doiverdianism, or whether it's framed in kind of Rushdunian terms or Reconstructionist terms. There's a whole bunch of ways in which this might be parsed, and it will depend on your view of eschatology and your view of the Old Testament law and so on. But Reformed people are generally, going to give three hearty cheers to the idea that we have a task to do in the world, which entails subduing the world, and that work, understood vocationally, is part of that. Kyle's goal was to get beyond that, not to leave it behind, but to build on it. And I was enthusiastic about it for that reason. I'd done a lot of teaching here at All Saints, especially for the men, actually, men's discipleship breakfasts, that kind of thing, where we had been trying to encourage the guys to think biblically about their work, to frame their work within that theological matrix, that biblical matrix, where they're seeing its significance in eschatological terms, in terms of discipleship for themselves and their children, their responsibilities to the world around us, even the evangelistic impact of our lives. But what I frequently found was that you'd get a huge amount of enthusiasm, and then you'd be leaving the guys to say, okay, guys, go off and do this. And it's not obvious to people how. And especially with some of the shifts in the social and political landscape in recent years, there are some new challenges and also some new opportunities, which, if we approach them right, could enable us to go about the how in some fresh and exciting ways. So when Carl came to me with this conference idea, I thought, yeah, that sounds great. I'm on board with that. That sounds good.
So I'd like to touch on something quickly here. I don't want to get too deep into it, but you have brought up the eschatological connection with regard to our work. There's a kind of folk theology popular in certain circles in the United States and Protestantism, which more or less dismisses the vocational dimension of our lives, and does that in order to emphasize the importance of evangelism. So sometimes people will say, like, everything that we do here except winning souls is going to burn, or something like that. So why invest yourself in those things?
Yes.
Not picking up on certain, I think, pregnant scriptures that seem to contain the promise that no, that's not the case. Actually, our works will follow us. And what does that mean? So can you quickly maybe address that?
Yes. And I want to do so in a way that honors what's good in the all that counts really is evangelism point. In other words, it really does matter, whatever your eschatology and whatever your location on the Reformed or evangelical spectrum, it really does matter that we have compassion for those around us who are lost. Your next door neighbor or your parents or your friends in the workplace who don't know Christ. It really matters that we take the opportunity where we can to witness to them, to share our faith with them, to share our lives with them, with the goal prayerfully underscored of winning them for Christ. I don't want anything I say to be taken as a critique of that. I think what's wrong with that stance is not what it affirms, but what it denies, often implicitly, sometimes explicitly. In other words, I want to be gung-ho evangelistically and insist that it's not true that the only thing that matters is evangelism. I mean, pushed to its extreme, it would be unworkable. I mean, if you say that evangelism is the only thing that matters and that nothing else has any ethical call upon us, then I don't know how you eat, sleep, even pray, never mind go about your daily vocation. Right. What we really need is an eschatological outlook that coordinates all these different elements of our lives rightly in relation to each other. Now, for myself, I'm post-mill. I want to say that there are many, many different ways in which the kingdom of Christ is being built through history. There is a kind of urgency to the evangelistic task that arises from the fact that our friends and neighbors and our elderly parents and grandparents might not be around forever. They're certainly not going to be around forever. They might not be around for much longer. But at the same time, there is a long-term vision for cultural transformation and kingdom growth, which within a post-mill eschatology can be integrated with those concerns. That long-termism is connected to covenant theology, is connected to practical matters of raising your family and raising godly children, and is connected to worship. If you think that worship is, so to speak, the source of renewal from which the transformation of the people of God and then the world around flows. And evangelism is part of that, and what we do at work is part of that. But if we see that we have a distinct calling to shape the world Christianly, to honor Christ in the created order where he's placed us, that it's not all going to burn, it's all going to be transformed, but it's going to endure, that adds an extra theological depth to the incentive to build now for the future. I don't think it's the case that Luther actually said, if I knew the world was going to end tomorrow, I'd plant a tree today. But the sentence, I think, is probably made up and attributed to him. But I've heard it attributed to him a number of times. And it expresses a sentiment that at the most basic level is really important to factor into our thinking about our own lives. History is all about eschatology. Eschatology is all about history. Our lives are part of the unfolding of what God is doing in the world. And part of that is going to be an evangelistic task. Part of it is going to be fulfilling our callings in whatever vocation we have. And we have to find a way of integrating those into a single big picture.
That's great stuff. So, Tom and Glenn, do you have any thoughts here to pitch into the conversation?
Yeah, I think really from the get-go, you see right at the heart of Scripture, as you mentioned, the notion that part of what it means to be an image bearer of God is work. Work isn't a result of the fall. It's right there at the heart of things. And it is right there in forming and fashioning in relationship to God that it is a worshipful activity. And so if it's a worshipful activity and it's ordered worshipfully the right way, it's also a life manifesting activity. And if you notice in the New Testament, that life manifesting activity is taken up into a relationship to our sacramental worshipful lives. Well, think of what's going on there. New Testament says, bring all things into conformity to Christ, that he has come to fill all things. This is a comprehensive vision. There's nothing about it that is just about merely trying to grab a soul here and grab a soul there. Those are important. Those are key. But you're dealing with a holistic vision. And so then you also hear the language of Christ is Christ is the cornerstone, and we are building on that. we're building a temple, if you will. And that's another worshipful language of creation and its continuance. So the scripture is filled with that language, and the Reformed rightfully put their emphasis on certain keys of that. And I think, retrieving this at a time like this, where people tend to, make a competition between the active Christian life versus the reception of all things. I often tell my students in theology, I'll often say, how much does your enactment of your creatureliness depend merely on you? None. In other words, you're always receiving your creatureliness even as you enact it. It's the same with the life of grace. Even though you owe all of the life of grace to God at every moment, it doesn't mean it's all passive. It actually is what frees you to truthfully enact what you're meant to be as an image bearer of God, conforming to Christ. So the active life, the life of works, is not in competition with grace. It's actually the outflow of properly receiving it. So, I think this is something that I think is core for us to get at this time.
Yeah. Paul said,
I like that a lot.
what do you have that you have not received?
Yeah. No, I love that. And your emphasis on the image of God, Tom, I think is really important, because you don't have to look too far in the Reformed tradition. Think of someone like Herman Bavinck to find the insistence that it's not just human beings, but the whole creation that is in the image of God, which, of course, is why language about creation can so readily be used to describe God.
Yeah.
Well, what that means then is creation is God's project. Creation and providence, we might say, is God's project of creating something which images him. Yeah. And so we are, so to speak, his leading preeminent agents in so ruling, in the Genesis 1 sense, over the created order, that we become the means by which he shapes his world in his way. It's the heavenization of earth happens by faithful Christian men and women doing faithful and good work in the workplace. And as soon as you start to see that, it has all kinds of practical implications. I can remember we had a really fruitful conversation here with many of the guys in the church, and a couple of men who, one's an elder, one is now a deacon, who both work for companies where they employ quite a lot of Christians. And what they both wanted to emphasize, among other things, was that as a Christian in the workplace, your primary responsibility is to be the best and most competent employee you can possibly be. And that captured something simultaneously very practical and very profound. It's honoring to God to be a really, really good salesman, school teacher, accountant, real estate agent, whatever it is that you're doing, because you're playing your part faithfully and competently in God's project to take this good and wonderful, though sin-stained world and glorify and transform it. So, I love that. The image of God theme has got to be pretty central here.
Yeah, and I would add to that. Now, here I'm going to have to disagree with Bavinck, I'm afraid. When you look at the way the term image of God is used in the ancient Semitic world, in the ancient Near East, it was actually a claim that was made by kings. When they said they were the image of a god, what they were saying is that god gave them authority to act as their regents and to rule. And you sort of touched on that there. So in Genesis, it says that God made man in his image and gave him dominion. It's parallelism. Those two really mean essentially the same thing. So if we are not continuing the work that God gave us in forming and filling the world, we are not actually acting as the image of God anymore. And if we reject that as part of our calling, then we're basically rejecting the image of God. I would say it goes that far. If all we're here for is evangelism and not exercising dominion, then we're saying we're giving up our position that God has given us in the world.
Related to that, Glenn, you've got the forming and the filling, which you've returned to many times, and that's great. But it's both those things are under attack today.
Right.
We've got the filling with the kind of antinatalism, which we're familiar with, but then the forming with the kind of radical ecological sort of ideology that maintains that human beings are a blight on creation.
Right. And one of the effects of that, we talked about the forest fire things and, the wildfires that come up because of a misunderstanding of what it means to actually manage the world that God has given us. But the other thing that happens, I think it was, who was it? Dallas Willard maybe said something to the effect that when faith is opposed to works, it is not opposed to effort. It's opposed to earning.
Right.
It's opposed to merit. Yeah.
Right.
It's opposed to earning your way in. So works are not a bad thing unless you're trying to use them to earn something. When you look at John the Baptist's preaching, he didn't tell people to stop their work. He told them to do it in a godly way. When Jesus converts Zacchaeus, he doesn't tell him to stop being a Roman tax collector. He just tells him to do it honestly. Not everybody is called to be an evangelist.
Yeah, related to this, Glenn, is the notion that a good Christian should never try to work in such a way that his work is praised. So, for example, when the Lord, tells his disciples that someday they will shine like the sun, there's something praiseworthy that will be on display through them. Now, of course, it comes from God, but at the same time, whenever you are, say, at your grandma's house and she makes a really great meal, you don't say, "Grandma, I'm not going to say thank you to you. It's all God. There's nothing. There's no place for you in this at all. So I'm just going to ignore the role you played in all this, and I'm just going to send my thanks right up to the throne." Now, we'd all say that was ridiculous, but sometimes I think certain folk theologies actually promote that way of thinking.
I wonder, Glenn, I mean, just to bring a bit of clarity to what I think Bavinck is trying to say here, and I think, again, I'm agreeing with your affirmation here. It's certainly the case that the language of the image was used, for example, of the statue of the king that was erected in the town square to show who's in charge here, for example. So we're images of God in the sense that we're like God in certain respects, which allows us to do what he does in certain respects, hence the parallelism with taking dominion and so on. I guess what my understanding of what Bavinck is doing there, and it does turn out to be important for how we think about our work, it's something like this. First, that though the term image or likeness, neither term is used in Genesis in relation to non-human creation. Nonetheless, within a broader scriptural framework, it's certainly true that those other created things are like God. They all come from him, and he's described in terms derived from them. But I think there's another way of taking it, which is to say, what God does as a worker is make things in God's image. And we, as workers made in his image, are called to make things in his image, in the sense that we can take confidence in the fact that by mixing our work with the raw materials of his good creation, by his grace, we can bring something forth from that he's pleased with, which is more eschatologically, teleologically oriented to how things ought to be. Now, I'd very cheerfully relinquish the term image to describe that, because it's not a scriptural term that's used in that sense. I wouldn't want to trip over the terminology. But the idea that, let's put it like this, God has put some of his own glory into trees and rocks and sand. Yeah. And we, by turning trees into houses and rocks into jewelry and sand into iPhones, have the capacity also to infuse those things with divine glory and to bring honor to him by doing so. I think that's where I'd want to get to. Is that way of framing it, Glenn, more in keeping with what you'd be happy with?
Well, yeah, I was just focused on the use of the word image there, because to me, image is an issue of calling. Mm-hmm. More than a state. So, I mean, I understand the idea. I talk a great deal about the world being sacramental, that it points beyond itself to divine truth. And so in that sense, I suppose you could, image can be used in the modern sense that way. I just question whether that's what was really meant in Genesis.
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed.
But for the rest of it, I'm right on board with you for everything else there.
Yeah, I think Bavinck is just he made his peculiar use of the word image there, but he's just tapped into something that was classical Christian view of creation. You have variations of it. Dionysius, Aquinas, their own way, are saying very similar things. Maximus the Confessor too, that the fact that creation is God's creation means it's analogous in its own distinct kind of ways to the Creator in some way. And they all refract a different aspect of God's glory, with human beings being at a sort of pinnacle. And of course, this is an issue for Lucifer, right? And this is why you got to bring this image down. But that's a whole other trail. But one of the things I think you're right on about is the way in which the artisanal and in artistry is understood in this rich vision of what we're to be about in our fashioning and forming. In our creaturely activities. And this is where, again, you have different traditions will emphasize it different ways. Tolkien does it with co-creating. He'll go so far as to creating analogous, imaginative worlds. But in this case, what you have is all of creation has a certain form and gift about it, and intelligibility and potential, that are part of the life manifesting, when they're oriented properly to the Creator, they're life manifesting, both in the creaturely sense, but when brought into conformity to Christ in a fuller sense, manifesting his saving glory. This is what sacraments do. But with the creation, there is potential that is within it. And part of our endowment as image bearers of God is to work with this potential and unfold it in a whole host and variety of creative ways that bring both our gifted stamp onto it as a gift from God, but also in doing so, as it's oriented to the Creator, it becomes a work of praise. It's a worshipful activity all the way down. What happens is when we try to take what is potential in created things and orient them in directions they're not meant to go, or not to the glory of the Creator, that's where we bring a frustration into things. This is where technology and malformations of creation become part of death works rather than life manifesting and life giving. So I think with the Reformed emphasis here in Bavinck, you have a call in Christ to retrieve, to restore and renew that original task, but now with a fuller vision that lasts into eternity.
I'd like to jump on something here quickly, Tom, because you brought up, I think, something really important, and that when you were speaking to what is potentially present or latently present in creation. I'm afraid that in many circles, when I hear Reformed people use the term dominion, what I'm actually hearing is a kind of Baconian impressing upon sort of the Plato of reality our wills. Yeah. Now, our wills are shaped by God's will, but that there's nothing already present that we can discern. It's eerily, sometimes it can be almost, take on an ideological character as opposed to a theological character when we think in those terms. Another thing I like to get into, so just throwing one bomb into the room, but here's another one. When Steve mentioned, sorry about that, Steve.
I've been called worse.
when Steve mentioned the eschatological, hope that we have, that's in some way our works follow us, or in some sense they live on. I don't really think people get that. I think that people really have a hard time believing it, because I think they really do think it just all passes away. The hope of the resurrection spills over into the created order itself, as we see in Romans 8. And that, and here's a place where we mentioned Tolkien a minute ago. Another story that he told, kind of a short story that I think was kind of autobiographical, Leaf by Niggle. And the way that story ends is that even though there's only one leaf left at the end in the fallen world we live in. He gets to enjoy the tree that he painted in an eternal and ever sort of more beautiful state in the future. And I think that if we really saw our work in the way that Tolkien seems to be at least hinting at, that I think our attitudes would be much more worshipful, and we'd apply ourselves more, all that stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. And the eschatological point, I think, it's a complex one because it starts to bring in questions of pre, post, A, and so on. But there are more fundamental questions about continuity and discontinuity between the world in which we now live and the life of the resurrection, which to a certain extent can be asked independently, at least of deciding between amill and postmill. And the continuity transformation theme is suggested, I think, by meditation on Paul's use of the seed image in 1 Corinthians 15. He likens the body that is sown to a seed. And just think for a second how an oak tree seed differs from and is nonetheless continuous with the tree that comes from it. You of course there's continuity. I mean, in biological terms, there is genetic continuity, there is material continuity and substantial continuity. And yet at the same time, the glory of the oak tree when it's 150 years old so far surpasses the glory of that seed. Yeah. And I think that perspective allows us simultaneously to say, look, that the resurrection life is going to be so much more glorious than this that it's hard to put it into words. We need people like Jonathan Edwards and the Apostle Paul to put it into words for us. But at the same time, what we are doing now is the seed from which that will come. Think of Jesus' parable of the talents. There is some very definite continuity between the kind of people who are sown into the ground and the kind of people that we'll be raised as. And we are, I can't remember who used this phrase, it might have been Robert Jensen, we are the agglomerations of all of our thoughts and words and deeds up to the point that we've reached in our lives. And so at the moment of our death, we will be, so to speak, the integral in mathematical terms of all the things that we've been and done and thought and experienced up to that point. And that's the seed that will be sown. That's the body that will be raised. The body as the integrated sum of everything that we've done. And if we can see our work, vocational work, in that light, we start to see, it's not just that we're making the world a better place and employing people and allowing them to provide for their families and mentoring young men and young women as Christians. We are shaping the future, not just of this world, but of the new heavens and new earth.
One place that you can see this, and I'm going to tie this back to evangelism here, is if you take a look at what Jesus did. It's interesting. You read the first chapters of Matthew and you see him doing all kinds of miracles. He heals the sick, he raises the dead, he cleanses lepers, he casts out demons, all of these things. Then when he commissions his disciples, and then he also proclaims that the kingdom of heaven is near. When he commissions his disciples, what does he tell them to do? Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons, and tell them that the kingdom of heaven is near. Do what I was doing. Well, what that amounts to really is what I've described as show and tell. Show them what the kingdom looks like and tell them about it. Now, what is he doing when he's showing the kingdom? He is fixing everything that's broken around him. And you can't tell me that the work that he is doing in healing the sick and raising the dead and cleansing lepers and casting out demons is stuff that only applies in this world, that it doesn't have implications for eternity. And if we think about kingdom building in those terms, showing what the kingdom looks like, which is fixing the things that are wrong, providing things that are needed for people, all of those kinds of things, demonstrating what the kingdom of God actually looks like in practical terms in the world around us, it's going to be things that will resonate clearly into eternity. It just seems, that is, if you're engaged in kingdom work, it's not just for this lifetime.
Yes, yes. Well, Paul concludes his resurrection chapter in exactly that vein, doesn't he? Because he's just finished this grand exposition of the doctrine of the resurrection and of its centrality. And what he doesn't say is, therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of evangelism of the lost. He says, always abounding in the work of the Lord, which seems to suggest that the work of the Lord is to be understood in a kind of totalizing way. All of our work is work in the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. And that's an Ecclesiastes echo. It's like all of the things that we do, eating and drinking and working and building houses and getting married and raising families, all these things which have a kind of pre-resurrection finitude and vanity about them. In the light of the resurrection, we see that they're not in vain after all, therefore we should give ourselves to them. So it will be a very tortured logic that said that on the basis of the resurrection we should abandon those things. Of course we shouldn't.
Yeah, and
I wanted...
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go on, Tom. I wanted to ask a question that Glenn had raised in my mind earlier, but you go ahead, Tom.
Oh, well, I think, again, one of the areas that has often hurt, at least contemporary, contemporary can be a long time in terms of, Protestant thought as a whole, but it has affected all of Christendom in some way or another, has been a real loss of a lot of the richness of the vision of creation as Christians understood it. I was reading some of the earliest church fathers. I'm talking the first letters of Corinthian, outside, after the scripture was first written, to where they're already talking about the splendor of the created order, its harmony and its beauty, and the capacity to see this. And I understand where they were carrying their witness out was an emphasis on the rational order and the like. But one of the things they don't lose in their redemptive emphasis is this huge testimony of the beauty and grandeur and splendor of the creation and created things and their goodness. And there is this, what you could almost call reaffirmation of the Edenic ontology, the Eden's understanding of creation, its orderings and its flourishings and its purposes that are constantly reaffirmed over and over and over again, even through all the brokenness, fallenness. And Glenn just hit on it. When you get Jesus showing up on the scene, he is bringing about a healing and a reversal of all that which goes against and decreates, if you will, all that which is anti-creation. And then part of what we're given in the gospel is also insight back into the goodness of creation and its significance in relationship to Christ, the Logos, the Creator. And one of the things Augustine says is what we're given as we bring things into the light of Christ is their definition back to us, their real meaning. And I think this is one of the areas that at our time where the significance and meaning of created things, male and female, the significance of these gifts that are reaffirmed over and over again because they're from the beginning, they're given to us in the light of Christ. In light of the resurrection, their significance. I know there is the discontinuity where in Christ there is neither male nor female, but these things across the board are not simply things that are eradicated and erased. They're fundamental to the good gift of what it means to be a creature. And so for them to be transformed is not to have their meaning negated. Anyway, I think a lot of times we think of it as if it's just going to be all erased and done away.
Yeah. Can I ask, Glenn, you mentioned the sacramental character of the created order. And I wonder if you could just say a word or two more about that, because it's something I remember encountering and reflecting on a while ago, but it's been a while. And I have a feeling that there may be some valuable connections here as well to the theme of work. Can you just elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yeah, the idea of a sacrament is, the original definition of a sacrament is, the definition we usually use, it's a visible sign of an invisible grace, is sort of the short version of it. But the Catholic and Orthodox world talks about things that aren't sacraments, but that are sacramental, in the sense that they're physical objects or physical things that point beyond themselves to deeper spiritual reality. And really, in if you read Scripture, that's the entire cosmos. Pretty much everything that you look at, it was placed there to point beyond itself to God. You look at Psalm 19, you see this. You see it in Psalm, multiple Psalms. One of the examples I use is the one that talks about your righteousness is like the mountains of God, your judgments like the great deep. So the mountains and the ocean, the great deep, are there to point us to something about the character of God's righteousness and justice. How many things are the flowing stream, the streams of living water, all of these kinds of things. The righteous man is like a tree planted by streams of water. The heavens declare the glory of God. All of these things are sacramental in that they point beyond themselves, like I said, to deeper realities, to deeper spiritual realities, and at the end of the day, to God himself.
I'd like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to propose or frame a question and let you guys respond. I know you have something you want to say, Steve, so I didn't mean to cut you off, but
I'm going to anyway.
I think there's a kind of an ongoing but unnecessary tension between the ontological dimensions of the Christian faith and its eschatological dimensions. People, it's sometimes put in terms of the a-mill versus post-mill tension, as though there's no metaphysical dimensions to Christianity if we believe in postmillennialism, or there's no eschaton if we believe in the ontological dimensions of the Christian faith as they are real now in every way. So my thought is that your comments, Glenn, I'm completely on board with. And yes, the creation does speak, but it's going to speak in a new way. And I know you believe this, when everything comes to its to its end point. And I don't mean end in the sense of annihilation, but in terms of the telos. And when everything is taken up, or everything comes down, depending on how you want to think about it.
Yeah, I would say right now things are sort of garbled, and as Paul says in Romans 8, subject to futility. But Christ's resurrection, I'm convinced, isn't just the paradigm for our own resurrection. It's a paradigm for the new heavens and new earth. And of course, when that happens, things are going to be a whole lot clearer than they are now. Right now, the creation is subject to futility. It doesn't point to God as successfully as it will. We don't see God as clearly in it as we should, or as we will. But that doesn't dismiss that character that it has, that it still performs that function.
Any thoughts about my little curveball there, Steve?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to respond to it.
If you want to reject it in total, it's fine. It just I'm just thinking out loud.
I'm still thinking about what you said, and honestly, it's not a thought I'd encountered before. Maybe if I just give voice
that's not a good sign, Steve. That's usually a sign of paradox.
It might be a very good sign for me. I might be about to learn something, and that's always encouraging. If I just bounce and recognizing that this may not exactly be what you have in mind, and try and bring together your comments with what Glenn was talking about a moment ago in relation to the sacramental character of the world. That is how I've heard the word used before, and it's refreshing, Glenn, to hear you talk about it in that way. It is the kind of way, just to go back to Barving, is what he means by the sense in which the world is an image of God. Yeah. But what it suggests, the idea of the created order as sacramental, draws us towards the domain of worship as a category for understanding created things and created activities. And it is fascinating to me how we take wrongly and how we should take rightly the New Testament worship texts. The classic one that in my English evangelical upbringing was set before us frequently was Romans 12:1, where Paul appealed to you by the mercies of God, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual logikos, worship. The way that was presented was as though what it means is a kind of desacralization of worship. Worship now comes out of the sanctuary into the world. So the way we should understand worship is not formal gathered communion with God, but rather lives of worship in the sense of service. Well, I think that's half right and half wrong. I think, what if the pull is the other way? What if instead of saying we're supposed to bring worship out of the holy sanctuary and into the world, what we're really saying is we're bringing the world into the sanctuary, so that all of the things that we do now in the world are holy worship. To say that your lives of Christian service and your working as an insurance salesman and your real estate brokerage and your chopping down trees and pruning bushes in your daily vocation is worship, is to say that is a sacramental offering to the living God. In other words, what we're doing is we're bringing, and this is the connection to what you said, Chris, we're bringing the ontological substance of created stuff and created activity into the sanctuary, and it's becoming holy. Now, I think you can then make the step from sanctuary worship to eschatology. That's not quite the question you asked, but I'll pause there and see if Thomas wants to jump in.
Well, I think right here is where the other point that I was talking about a little earlier also comes into play. And this is the fact that along with that, in our enactment of our faith in the world, there is an enactment that conforms to Christ when we relate to things in light of their true natures, which are given an intelligibility in the gospel that wasn't there before because of the fall in the darkened mind. And because of that, we are receiving, in a sense, a definition of the things in the world in a way that they're no longer idols to us, and our loves are no longer malformed in relationship to them. So there is a way in which our own enactment of our creatureliness is a continuous act of worship in the world. And this is why when it's done faithfully, it evokes a response from the fallen world in a very negative way, because we're relating to the world in light of its true reality, both its fallenness, but also its real gift as creature. We're honoring the dignity of creation the way it was intended to go, and we're relating to it in that way. We are relating to creation the way God intended it to be related to, not the way the world has distorted that relationship. So there is a very thick aspect to both our witness and worship going both directions, in church, out of church. And we're bringing eschatology to bear into the moment.
Yeah.
You know, an interesting thing, that one of the ways people have interpreted the Reformation is that what the Reformation did is took monastic spirituality and made it for everybody. And that's essentially what you're saying here.
Yeah. It's, I don't know whether that's quite exactly the same as a way I've heard it from Luther and even other earlier reformers or pre-Reformation writers, that the recognition that you don't need to be a monk in order to honor Jesus. You can be a shoemaker, or you can wash dishes, or you can be a milkmaid. But your way of framing it, again, I think is more powerful, because what it does, it doesn't just say you don't have to do that holy stuff in order to be doing valuable vocation. What it actually says is that stuff is holy vocation. It is, you are in the newly formed sanctuary where the Spirit is flowing out across the whole world. This is how I'd connect it to eschatology, by the way. If you wanted to do it at the level of principle, what you'd say is that the burning, let's do it in terms of biblical symbolism, the burning candelabra that once stood in the sanctuary like a burning tree is now burning people, burning by the Spirit, who drives them out across the world with the message of the gospel, transforming people's lives and callings. So that it's not that, we all have to go to Jerusalem. It's that the sanctuary is now in heaven, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God, and therefore it is present everywhere as the Spirit flows out. And so our eschatology has to somehow take account of the fact that earth is being heavenized by the Spirit who's flowing out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And that was really at the heart of what I was getting at.
Can I ask a question, Chris, about what I took to be your comments on the misunderstanding of dominion? It suggested in my mind a related thought, which is, rather than a Baconian misunderstanding, just a more crass misunderstanding of work as dominion, as kind of hyper-simplistically masculinized activity. And we're living in an age where, for all kinds of dumb reasons, being a faithful man distinctively is looked down upon in the secular world around us, if there's such a thing as a secular world. And so sometimes Christians, we do all of our worst thinking by reaction and creating a kind of caricatured response. And I sometimes fear that what that means is that men feel they have to do something which amounts to a sort of sanctified chest thumping, and that's where the fight is. Right. One of the things I'm really keen to emphasize to guys here in a pastoral context is to say, look, the fight, let's just pick that biblical image, the fight against the evil in the world, and to a certain extent against the evil in our own hearts, does not just take place in your response to the diversity, equity, and inclusion mandates in your workplace. It takes place in your patient, gracious responses to over-demanding clients. It takes place when you're first into the office and last out. It takes place when you uncomplainingly clear up the mess that somebody else in your workplace has made. It takes place when you go the extra mile to do the thankless task that you're doing for the Lord, not for men. That's actually the fight against the spirituality, the spiritual authorities and powers in the heavenly places that have been thrown down. That because what you're actually doing is serving, in the sense of worshipping, as the servant did and does.
Yeah, your description reminded me of that meme from The Office where the guy says, "I'm going to do it twice as hard." In other words, if you claim that I'm toxic, I'm going to be twice as toxic. That kind of thing. I think a really good response to this, as it's related, but specific to the trades. There's that great book by Matthew B. Crawford, Shop Classes, Soulcraft. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, have you had a chance to read that, by the way?
Yeah, I've read that. Yeah, great.
Oh, yeah, it's great. So early on, he addresses this. He says, boys brag, men just do things. And his point is that when you're doing something that's intrinsically valuable, you don't need to shout about it. You just point. You say, if you're an electrician and you wired a room and now the lights come on, you just point and say, there. I don't need to defend my significance or my agency. I just do things. And I think that kind of quiet confidence sometimes is what actually everybody wants, even feminists.
But do you think there's a danger? Do you think that sometimes people feel it's almost like a kind of insecurity? It's as though they feel they need to be noticed in order to be significant. And it is a kind of faithlessness. Don't you know the Lord sees your labors? He sees what's done in secret.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. At the same time, I think we do, justifiably expect acknowledgement. So let's say, Steve, you found one Sunday at church that you're not going to be paid anymore. It's just you should be doing it unto the Lord, and you get my joke.
It feels for a lot of this work.
we never say thank you, or we never compliment you on your sermons, Pastor Steve, because after all, it's to the Lord. But I'm having some fun with this.
Yeah, no, I understand. And I think there have been pastors who have been exactly like that. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to talk about my own past. I have been blessed wonderfully by the churches that I've worked for, but there have been contexts in which the affirmation of people who ought to care and the affirmation of the Lord have not resonated well together. Of course, it ought to be the case that we appreciate what the Lord appreciates, that we say publicly, "Well done, good and faithful servant," to things which on the last day the Lord Jesus Christ will say. Mm-hmm. But in reality, that's not always the case for some people. And for many people, it's not the case all the time. And so what does faithfulness look like then? Well, faithfulness looks like, we had our last midweek Bible study of this portion of the year last night, and my fellow pastor Jeff Shaw gave out some thanks gifts to some mostly ladies who'd served us behind the scenes, and we knew who most of those ladies were because we'd seen them working away in the kitchen. But there were one or two whom nobody knew. Oh, that lady comes in once or twice a week and cleans all the gunk out of the kitchen so it's usable for all these different ministries that go on in our church. And the task of giving proper honor to people is to honor people in the way and according to the measure that Christ does. And I think we saw a fascinating illustration of that just last night.
Yeah, that's great. And this is, I guess, one of the ongoing, struggles or just a tension that we live with in life. There's always going to be kind of vainglorious, activity where people are trying to accrue credit to themselves and not acknowledge God's sovereign and providential ordering of things and blessings and gifts. And at the same time, we are looking forward to the day when our master says, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." So there's this just kind of ongoing challenge that we face in that respect.
I wondered if I could get your thoughts. Here's me asking the questions now, but on the contemporary working environment, one of the things that I know Kyle is really keen to do with the works-based conference is to give people an opportunity to respond to an environment that just in the last 10 years or so has become in some ways more hostile for Christians, but at the same time presents fresh opportunities for them. So on the one hand, there will be people who are a little frustrated with their work or their workplace or their employer and really feel like they're in need of encouragement. And but on the other hand, there'll be people who are in a position to move or to start something new or to consider starting their own business or whatever it would be. And one of the things that the works-based conference is seeking to do is not just to talk about that, but to actually provide a forum in which those conversations can happen. And some of the other speakers we've got, Andrew Krapachetz and David Barnson and David Rees, those are exactly the kind of people that I think different demographic sectors will want to talk to and hear from, not just to get advice about what to do, but actually to do it, because there'll be an environment created there in which people can make connections and people can get what they need to either make a move professionally and find a new job or to take a step into starting a business. And I'd be interested to hear you guys talk perhaps briefly about how you think that social environment, the workplace environment has changed in the last 10 years. My impression is that it has done so and makes something like this quite necessary.
Yeah, the HR departments and particularly large corporations are essentially just kind of regional offices for DEI university initiatives. There's been such a colonization of corporate America that's, I think, very really what happened. Now, each of us have a background in the academy and have had to live through this kind of stuff for a while. So like when I was in Cambridge and in Harvard and so forth, back in the 90s, you could see this stuff coming down the tracks, because you were actually with the people who were going to implement it. And you'd warn people about it, and no one would take you seriously. I remember the frustration I felt when I would say, this is what's going to happen, this is what's coming, you don't know, you don't understand, and they would just roll their eyes and say, oh, you eggheads in the academy, you guys are out of touch with reality. And well, I wish I wasn't right, but I have been right. And so, and another thing is that sometimes people who are outside the church don't realize that these dynamics can play out in the church as well, and in seminaries and in Christian colleges. And so the tensions that are felt at XYZ Corp, particularly pastors who are maybe in denominations that are liberalizing, or professors who are teaching at seminaries that are doing so and getting woke, we know exactly what you're talking about. It can affect our lives too.
Yeah, we have. You both, Chris and Glenn, are familiar enough with New England and its own challenges here. But similarly, when I was a few years back, I had several pastor friends who I would meet with regularly and try to talk about what is coming. And on the one hand, I don't know if they fully had an antenna for it, and I don't think they took it seriously. Well, past couple of years, especially with the whole movement, the whole issue of kind of critical theory entering the world, and then, of course, the whole transgender set of issues, they have been in desperation, and they're running to do these studies. No one in their congregations know how to even digest even Carl Trueman's, simpler book. And, it was just a hard thing to convince people in the church. But the other side of it was so many people in the church that once upon a time were trying to follow at least some kind of evangelical script have completely went off into lifestyles and stuff that formerly were, historically at odds with fundamental Christian ethics and belief. And so just the church itself is wrestling with that issue. How to have Christians be steady and strong in work environments is, I think, just a compounded set of issues.
Yeah, I'm afraid we're getting to the point where you need to wrap things up, but let's go to you, Glenn. Do you have anything you want to say in response to Steve's statement?
Well, yeah, I think that basically it would just be to echo you two. The critical theory has crept down from I want to say slithered down, I think might be a better word, from the academy into pretty much every institution in society, and especially in larger corporations. And it has created a hostile work environment for people who don't really want to sign on to a program that is fundamentally at odds with biblical revelation. So,
right.
And I don't think that there's any single answer you can give somebody in terms of what to do, other than while you are in your job, do it to the best of your ability, because we're supposed to work as unto the Lord, not unto men.
Right. Anyway, Steve, as we wrap up, anything you want to say? Maybe you should fill people in on some of the details. We're going to put a link in the show notes, of course, to the conference and the registration and page and all that. But anything that you want to say as we conclude?
Sure, great. Well, all the details are online at worksbased.com, WORKSBASED, worksbased.com. The conference proper is 28th and 29th of June this year. It's a Friday and a Saturday. There's actually a speaker dinner for which I think a few tickets are still available. That takes place on the Thursday evening. And the conference is all day on those days. So there will be seminars, opportunities for networking and making contacts, and a huge amount of semi-structured and unstructured time for building relationships, meeting new people, having new people introduced to you, as well as plenary talks and discussions and so on. So I'd encourage anybody who is either looking to branch out in their work, or who is just looking for the possibility of new opportunities, or thinks they might be looking for new opportunities at any point in the future, to consider it. And to be honest, anybody who's, you might be an employer and you're completely happy with your company's going great, you've got a bunch of great employees. Well, this might be a fantastic place to start building relationships which could put you in a position to expand in the future. Bring all your staff along. I mean, I'm very sure that Kyle would happily cut you a deal if you want to bring a whole office load of guys with you. And I say guys, men and women, there are family tickets. So anybody who's interested in the theology and practice of any aspect of work, workspace.com, check it out and see if you're available on 28th, 29th of June this year.
Well, that's great, Steve. I'm looking forward to being with you, and it's going to be a lot of fun. And hopefully some of the folks out there who are listening will take you up on your offer and be there with us. Thank you, by the way, for listening to the Theology Podcast. You've gotten all the way to the end, which means you get to hear a little bit about Patreon. We have a Patreon page, and you can become a patron. Enough of that. There's a link in the show notes. We should wrap this up. Anyway, thanks, Steve. We'll see you in about, 6 weeks, I guess.
Yes, sir. Take care.
All right.
Bye now.
The Theology Podcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.